الحمد لله على الصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. اللهم علمنا ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا زدنا علما إنك أنت عليم حكيم وصلى الله على سيدنا Muhammad وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. Okay, so alhamdulillah, welcome to the fourth session on inward sin. So alhamdulillah, we're looking at the source of this danger. Now, this danger, again, that he's talking about is the danger of Muslims becoming divided in their ranks, divided and having different objectives and intentions, and not unifying around the cause of drawing near to Allah, and thereby reviving the ummah and putting the ummah back to where it was in the past. So we have to remember, just remind everyone, the question that the Imam is answering here in this book is, why is it that we have so much quote unquote Islamic activity? We have conferences and we have events and we have retreats and we have all this activism, we have protests and demonstrations. There's all this activity going on, but Muslims don't seem to be moving anywhere. We're not reviving the Ottoman Empire or the Abbasid Empire or anything like that. We just are as we are, despite all this activity, Tao activity, whatever it is you want to call it. So what the Imam's getting at, what he's been addressing the past, as we look at the last few sessions, is we're addressing it's the inward problem. It's the inward problem. It's the fact that we're not actually unified in our hearts. We have different things going on inside, right? We're not really sincerely trying to revive the ummah or trying to bring Muslims together, trying to draw near to Allah. We actually have worldly desires that we're concealing behind this activism and these slogans and so on and so forth. So what he's getting at in this chapter on page 27, the source of this danger, is he says the root of the problem of this great danger is the heart's attachment to this worldly life, right? So our hearts are attached to this worldly life. And what it means is we give it a higher rank than it deserves, a higher rank than Allah has given it. So we have to understand, we have to put the dunya in the proper perspective, that the dunya is not the be all and the end all, right? So if you remember back to the last book, Man and Law, Justice on Earth, as well as the Civilization book, which we didn't cover, but if you did read it, Man and Law's, the approach to human civilization in the Quran, Allah, Imam al-Buti explains to us the rank of this dunya, and based on the ayat in the Quran, how Allah, for example, we know that the dunya has a very, very low rank on the side of Allah, on the Messenger of Allah. So it's the dunya shown contempt, but at the same time, it is regarded as the seedbed for the hereafter. So Imam al-Buti puts it together. He says, when you think of this worldly life, you should think of it as an exam. It's like an exam at school, right? It's very, very short. It's very, very short, but it does have long-lasting consequences. Right? So if you think of an exam that maybe you did at university or in school, you think, okay, that exam maybe took me an hour to do, 2 hours to do, but the results affected everything. The results affected my career path, my trajectory. I had to pass that exam in high school in order to get to university. If I hadn't passed that exam, I would have had to make certain changes and gone. My life could have gone in a completely different way. It's the same thing here. We have to think of it that life is very, very short, so you don't invest in terms of it. That's the be all and the end all, right? No one plans on moving into the exam room and living there forever. But you put in the right perspective that you don't get all excited about the exam in the sense that this is the be all and the end all, but you do realize that what I do here does have profound consequences. This is the this is why he goes on to say, he says that this worldly life. Now, when people think about the dangers of the dunya, what he goes on to say here is, when people think about the dangers of the dunya, they think, okay, being dunyawi is simply a material thing, right? They think being dunyawi, that's just a material thing. So you can be dunyawi if you have a big house, or an expensive car, or you have a yacht, or you have real estate. That's dunyawi, right? Whereas if I live a simple life, I just live I live a simple life. I live in a simple house and I have a simple car and I have, that's not dunya. But what Imam Al-Buti explains, says you got to be careful. That's not the only definition of dunya. Like we don't say that so and so's dunyawi, he's a worldly person because he has all these worldly possessions, and this guy's not worldly at all because he doesn't have any serious worldly possessions. Like, no, 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 no. Very similar to how we discussed before in Man, Allah, Justice on Earth, when we talked about tribulation In the same way that you cannot judge a tribulation based on outward aspects, say, well, that guy must be suffering so much because he's blind and he's deaf and he's in a wheelchair and he's poor, and that guy must be so happy because he has a big house and a big car. It's the same thing here. So, because he says that the dunya is not just that, the dunya is also having inclinations in the soul towards influence, rank, leadership, prestige, and so on and so forth. Right. So, so for example, you can have someone who we'll take the same example before. You can have someone who has worldly possessions, right? So he has a big fancy house, he has a nice car, he has land, he has other accoutrements or other luxuries of this world. But he's not a genuine person. Why? Because his heart's in the right place. His heart is not attached to any of those things. He owns those things, but those things are in his hand, not in his heart. Whereas you can have someone who doesn't have any of those things, doesn't have any of those worldly trappings, but he's dunyui in the sense that why in his soul he wants rank, he wants leadership, he wants position, he wants people to look up to him, he wants people to admire him, he wants the fame, he wants all these things. So he says you have to be careful about that. Don't judge someone's worldliness just by what they have and their possessions. It's all about what's in the heart. That's why I mention these things. So he says, so all those things like this love of leadership or love of rank, love of influence, these are all things that Allah tests man with, right? And therefore, and part of the wisdom is, again, because we're slaves of Allah and we're trying to build a loving relationship with Allah, Allah puts us in a position where we struggle. We struggle against this, and we struggle against our nafs, we struggle against our soul, we struggle against these desires, and that draws us closer to Allah, right? Because we all have our struggles. We can't think it's an amazing thing. We all have our trials and tribulations. Allah's given, and we covered this before. La yukallifu Allahu nafsan illa wus'aha. Allah says nafs, not nufus in that ayah, Surah Al-Baqarah, the end of Surah Al-Baqarah, ayah 285, that Allah tests every individual soul what it can bear. Right? So we should never ever think that, well, because I'm not wealthy or because I don't have a big house or a big car and all these other things, that I'm not really tested by worldly desires because I don't have the means. Like, no, 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 no. Be careful. Don't assume that you do have your own struggles against the world, against worldly desires, which are in the form of love of leadership, love of influence, love of fame, love of reputation, and so on and so forth. So, and then he expands on this, right? And then this the love of these things that leads to things like pride, like envy, like ostentation, vanity, and then all kinds of malice and malevolence. Okay, so um, I was listening to Imam al-Buti this morning, actually. This is the other book that we have in the pipeline, Al-Hubb fil Quran. He talked about that. He said, so someone might be, a caller to Allah. That's what how you see himself. I'm a caller to Allah, and I go to different places and I give lectures. But then he starts competing with other people, right? Oh, so and so, how many people came to his event? How many people bought his recent book? How many people listened to his recent lecture? It becomes like a personal egoistic competition instead of being focused on Allah, because the desire is wrong. The desires for the world, the desires for reputation, the desires for fame, the desires for influence. So he said, so then he quotes the hadith of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is narrated by Bukhari and Muslim, where the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said in translation, by Allah, I do not fear for you poverty. Rather, I fear this worldly life will be presented to you on a platter for you just as it was presented to those before you, and thus you will compete for it just as they competed, and you will be destroyed just as they were destroyed. So, again, when we think about the context of civilization, something that Imam al-Buti makes very clear in this book and other books and in his teachings is that we have to remember, we always have to remember where we come from. We always have to remember where our source, what our true source is. Everything that we have comes from Allah. Everything we have comes from Allah. That it's our obedience to Allah and our devotion to Allah that took us. Again, we think of the Muslim Ummah as a whole. The Arabs who were living in Jahiliyyah and were in a very abject state, the utmost abject state. It was their devotion to Allah and their obedience to Allah that took them in a period of 23 years from being in a state of absolute backwardness to the very peak of civilization. To the very peak. It was because of Islam. It was because of their devotion. Because Umar ibn Khattab, he laid out very, very clearly. He said, "Nahnu qawmun azna Allah with Islam. Like we're a people who Allah made mighty through Islam, if we seek to be mighty through something else, Allah will just humiliate us. So, and then what he explains again, Imam Ramadan, is what can happen is when people move from that state of abject poverty or abject backwardness, and they move to this peak of civilization, they move to a position of power, a position of influence, and then they forget how they got there. They forget that as Muslims, we can forget this. We forget that, okay, it was because of our obedience to Allah that we got there. Instead, we start thinking like it's something intrinsic, like, oh, we're just here because we're Muslims. Like, no, 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 no. Once you forget where you come from, then it all goes downhill, right? And this is not something that's necessarily this is not necessarily like an esoteric or a spiritual phenomenon, right? This is something that happens with just everyday countries. This happens with businesses and organizations, right? Where sometimes a business, like I said, in the West, there's this expression. I don't know if you have this in Malaysia, Singapore, the expression "living off the name." Have you heard this expression before? Living off the name, where a corporation or company gets so big and successful that they can, what, think, well, we're just such a big successful company, we don't really have to try anymore, right? And then they start cutting corners. They don't put that much effort in, and they think, like, we're just this big company. No, we don't have any rivals. No one's going to take us out, right? And then and then things start going downhill from there because they don't recognize, they forget what got them into that position in the first place. Instead, they just rely on they rely on the name. They think, oh, we're just here intrinsically, right? Think of something like Kodak, right? It's a company that no longer exists, or no longer exists because people don't use cameras anymore, right? But people forget. Um, so this destruction comes about when Muslims are attached to this worldly life. Then the trust breaks down between them. The trust breaks down between them, and then that's when the enemy sweeps in, right? And I think I mentioned this before in previous sessions about, like, that Turkish series, with Ertuğrul Osman. But like in those series, which are very popular, they do show that very, very accurately, right? For all the flaws and faults, they do show that point very, very accurately. Where is you see the Muslims never ever suffered directly because of the Crusaders or because of the Mongols or some unbelieving enemy. It's never directly. It's always because the way they always show it is you have the Muslim Jama'ah they have their Emir, right, as whether it's Ertuğrul or Osman, but then someone within the rank becomes a traitor, right? Someone within their ranks becomes a traitor. Why does he become a traitor? Because of this, because of the inward sin. He becomes a traitor because he has some worldly desires, because he might think like, well, why am I not the emir? Or why do I not have all the money? Or why are we always fighting? Why can't we just be at peace? Why, right? And he starts causing division, right? He starts causing fitna amongst the Muslim Jama'ah, right? Then the enemy, right, could be Crusaders, could be Mongols. They're like, hey, yeah, that guy's causing trouble amongst the Muslims. Let's call him over. Then they arrange a secret meeting with him. And they say, okay, well, listen, if you can do such and such and such, we'll make a deal with you, right? And then from there, and then it causes complete utter havoc, right? Whereas if Muslims understand where they come from, and they fully understand that they're supposed to love Allah and not love the world, then they stay united. They stay united, and they don't get tempted by these things. See, you can see the chain reaction right there, or the chain of events, how it happens. You have a traitor amongst your ranks. That's the root of the problem. You have a traitor amongst your ranks. Why is he a traitor? Because of the inward sin, because he has love of this world or some other issue, and then that leads him away. And then the enemies pounce. They take advantage of it. This happens every single time. And again, if you study the history of the Crusaders, like if you study, and I've mentioned this many times, maybe not here, but in other classes, if you were to look at, for example, the history of the Crusades, like the First Crusade, so like the Christians arrived from Europe in Jerusalem in 1099 in the Gregorian calendar, 1099, right? Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi and Imam Mahdi al-Qudama and the other, right, or the man, the Mujahideen, they don't take it back until 1187 after the Battle of Hittin, right? That's 88 years. Like, what's happening in that time? What's happening in that time is that the Muslims, Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi and Nur ad-Din Zengi, these people, they're cleaning up the mess, right? Instead of attacking the Crusaders head on, they started cleaning up the mess. So they started realizing we have so many internal problems that we need to deal with, right? We need to clean up the Hashishin cult. within Sham. We need to clean up the Fatimid Shiites in Egypt, right? That's what Saudi al-Ayyubi did. He raised an army, went past the Crusaders into Egypt, just went past them, made Egypt a Sunni country. That's why Azhar is a Sunni institution today. And then, or more so than that, is that Imam Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, what he did, and Nuruddin al-Zengi, is that in Egypt and in Sham, they built madrasas everywhere. They built madrasas everywhere, and then they raised an army from those madrasas. Right? They raised a righteous army, an army of tulab al-ilm, an army of hufad al-Quran, or an army of people who knew their fiqh, who knew their creed, who knew their hadith, they knew their just like an army of knowledgeable, righteous people, and that was the army. Right? That's what they understood. That this is why the Crusaders have been able to make this big dent in us. That they've been able to wound us in this way. Why? Because we've got some internal problems that we've got some serious internal problems that we need to solve first. So they solved the internal problems, and then they completely destroyed the external enemy. Right? This is just a fact of life. It's like a sunnah of Allah. Like the internal enemy is always the more dangerous enemy, is the internal enemy. So the consequences of this danger. So this is what he goes into the next section. He goes into the consequences of this danger is that, again, he says, I've already explained this to you. This is on page 29. Muslims become divided. This is what happens. When Muslims have these worldly desires and worldly ambitions, things become divided. Or Muslims become divided. And the Islamic work becomes nothing more than empty planning and activism that only affects their lives in the most superficial of ways. And again, this word activism, and this is something that people have started to notice, even amongst people who are not Muslim, like in the West, they notice this stuff. Like activism can be a good thing, but but you can't have this idea of, well, I'm going to change the world, but I'm not going to change myself. Again, we're back to it's the internal enemy first, right? This is part of why like Jordan Peterson's so popular, because he used the hashtag of clean your room. Right? You can't hope to change the world if you can't change your own house. You can't change your own room. Like your own room's a disorganized mess. Clothes everywhere, books everywhere, papers everywhere. But if that's the case, how are you going to change the world? How are you going to influence other people? Right? The change has to start with you. All right, and that ties in with what we know, right? Like the message, like Allah says in Surah Al-Ra'd, ayah 11, "Inna Allah la yughayyiru biqawmin hatta yughayyiru ma bi anfusihim." Allah does not change people until they change what is in themselves. The change has to start with you. So if the true love of Allah is not there in the heart, it begins to Allah, and it's just worldly desires, the activism doesn't really go anywhere because it doesn't affect people. So he says if Islam has less and less authority over the heart, and it continues to diminish until it has no authority whatsoever, this worldly life and the soul, along with its ambitions, takes over. And again, in the book Al-Hub al-Quran, Love of the Quran, Imam Ramadan makes this point. Like for a da'i, like if you're in the field of calling to Allah, whether it's you're calling non-believers to Islam, or you're calling people to be righteous, or you're calling people to worship Allah and to be good Muslims, it's not going to work if the love of Allah is not in your heart, because otherwise it's just empty slogans. It's just empty words. It doesn't matter how rhetorical or profound you are, or how good your arguments are, or how how much ilm al-kalam you know, and how sound your logic is. That doesn't have an effect. And he gave an old statement. He said, "Laysat an-nahiyatu kathakla," right? Meaning that the hired mourner is not like the bereaved, right? Some people say an-nahiyatu thakla laysa kal-nahiyatu mustajara, right? Because a nahiya is a woman who's hired to mourn at a funeral. Right? She's a hired mourner, right? She's hired to wail and mourn and say things about the deceased, right? But she's just doing it for money. It's her job, right? So she can sit there and she can recite poetry and she can sing songs and she can get really emotional and she can cry, but it doesn't affect anyone because it's not coming from her heart. It's coming from her throat. It's not coming from her heart, right? Whereas the person who's actually is bereaved, who's truly lost a loved one, that person only has to cry and it affects you. The person only has to sigh or moan and it affects you because the sincerity is coming from because it's insincere. That person is expressing sincere, true pain and agony and anguish and so forth. Whereas the hired mourner is just an act, right? It's an act for the sake of money. So then he says, the bearers of these hearts appear to people to be Muslims. They wish that Islam returns position of might and authority so that they can raise their heads high and have power and control. Now, this is a very interesting point here, right? Is that some people, you have to understand that within this field of activism, there are people who are actually using Islam as a vehicle. When the people who use Islam as a vehicle for their own personal ambitions, right? So people will use Islam. Well, I can use Islam to get into a position of power influence. I can use Islam to get into a position of political power. And again, this is where some people misunderstand the concept of imara. Like, what do we mean by an imara? What do we mean by the importance of having an emir and so forth? People misunderstand this. So, if you take it from the most basic understandings, yes, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has told us that when you're doing work, or not even that, when you're going, like if you're going on a journey, there's three people on a journey, there should be an emir, right? One of you should be an emir because one of you should make the decisions, right? Otherwise, it gets divided, right? So there's three people or more on a journey. You should decide. It's okay. We're going on this travel. We're going on this journey together. Ustaz Jalaluddin, you're the emir, right? We appoint you because we think that you know best what to do. And
Yes, we can
what
still
happened
see you.
there?
Nothing.
Okay,
Yeah, can still see you.
I guess I'll say yeah, it just disappeared. The screen, the Zoom screen just shut off.
Oh, we can still
Okay,
see you and yeah, and
okay,
hear
okay,
you.
okay. All right. Okay, okay. It just disappeared. The screen. It was weird. Okay. Yeah. So what I'm saying, like, so the purpose of the mirror, right? So this happens in certain situations, like if you're traveling or you're going on a journey, you appoint you're three or more people. You appoint a brother to be the emir, right? Like he's the guy who's going to decide. We think he knows best about where we're going and what we're doing, so we'll let him decide, right? Or he's the oldest amongst us, or he's the wisest amongst us. We'll choose him. Now, in the broader context, is that when we think of, because someone asked me this a long time ago, because people have in the West, they had this whole fear of like Muslims taking over, right? Muslims taking over. They're gonna establish Sharia in our lands and take no. But the way to understand this is Muslim governance, Muslims being in power, is it's an outcome as opposed to an objective. Right? I want to make this very, very clear. It's an outcome, not an objective. Right? It's something, meaning it's not something that we strive for. We don't deliberately strive for political power, but we understand that if we obey Allah and do what we're supposed to do, political power is a natural result of that. Right? Because when Muslims come together and they worship Allah and they do what they're supposed to do, and they focus on being righteous and they focus on drawing nearer to Allah, leaders naturally emerge. Right? A leader naturally emerges from a group. But we have the saying in English, the cream of the crop rises to the top. It's a natural thing. A leader naturally emerges. People follow that leader, and then you create a polity. Then you have a community. Then you have a jama'ah, and then you take it from there. It's not rocket science. It's not esoteric secrets. It's just very, very straightforward. That if everyone within a certain community is a righteous, upstanding Muslim, then their rulership will reflect that because the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam also said, "Kama takunu." This is related by Imam Suyuti in Sahih in his Jami Sahih or is it Sahih Jamia? He said that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Kama takunu yuwalla alaykum." As you are, you will be ruled over. As you are, you will be ruled over. So if you are righteous Muslims as a jama'ah, righteous Muslim people, you will have a righteous Muslim over you. That's just how it works. But the idea of the imara, this whole thing again, it's or an imara or khilaf, whatever it is, it's an outcome as opposed to an objective. It'll come about naturally through the righteousness of the Muslims, through the righteousness of the people who are going to be part of that khilaf or imara, whatever it is. Whereas if you just try to put that structure in place first without working on the people, you just get a dictatorship, right? You'll just get a corrupt dictatorship. And again, we have to see this. Again, look at the seat of the Messenger of Allah. The Messenger of Allah did not just set up a place of governance or a seat of governance right away. Instead, the Messenger of Allah, he trained people. He nurtured people. He gave people tarbiyah, right? And he raised, I mean, first with the Muhajirun, there were only about 500 people, right? Now you think about the Muhajirun and what they went through in Mecca, all the trials and tribulations and persecution and torture they went through in Mecca. I mean, those were people who really, really, really wanted to be Muslim. They really wanted to be Muslim. Like nothing could sway them. They went through so much uh, pain and anguish and torment. Then they come to Medina. They meet the Ansar, who had their own trials and tribulations, but not like the Muhajirun. Uh, and then they form a political body, right? And this is why, for example, Imam Al-Buti, his book on jihad, he explains this. He says now we have a situation where the Muslims have land, they have people living on that land, and now they have an emir. So now you have a proper governing structure, right? But that's built later, right? You have to build the people first. The people have to be built first. And the people have to be purified, the people have to be nurtured, and the people have to be educated. And then you can think about having some sort of political structure, right? Whereas, again, the amount of talking here about people who are just using Islam because they're hoping that we'll make Islam politically powerful and then we'll be in power. Yeah, it'll be us, right? This is wrong, and it's a worldly ambition. Um, Thus, to give victory to Islam, they do what other people do to give victory to their movement or denomination, meaningless action expressed by superficial ideas, theories, and organizations. And again, what he's getting at here, this point here, this is something again. I live in the UK, and I've noticed this a lot. Is that you see, in the past 20 years, I've seen this so much. Whereas people have this idea about Islam, but their activism is say no different from any say non-Muslim organization, right? So the way they're active is the same way that say Greenpeace would be active or a political party would be active, right? They think, okay, we need to get the message out there. Okay, so that means we need to do demonstrations, we need to do protests, we need to have marches, we need to put out flyers, we need to have banners, we need to have motivational talks. Okay, but that's what political organizations do, right? That's how is that what Islam is to you? Is Islam just an ideological movement? Is that what it is? Are we just like the Conservative Party or the Labor Party or the Respect Party or Greens, or is that what we are? Republicans, Democrats? Because and this is one of the things that I remember I was on a podcast with Dr. Shadi al-Masri like a few months back. He made this point. He said that as the difference between being a Muslim and being a member of one of these political organizations is as a Muslim, we are conscious of our Islam 24/7, right? We're always Muslim, right? We're praying 5 times a day. We have du'as, we have adhkar, we have our classes, we have our private readings. We're always Muslim, right? 24/7. These people with their organization, whether it's Greenpeace or the Conservative Party, or they're only into that like occasionally, like when there's an event or when there's a talk. Otherwise, they don't care. They have their own things, right? For them, it's just like a hobby or an interest, right? For us, Islam's not a hobby. It's not just something we do in our spare time. It's something it's something we do, it's something we are. So we can't let our Islam become that, where it's just something that we do occasionally. We treat it like a hobby, right? And I've seen this. Sadly, I've even seen this at what they call, I don't know what you call, we call it Islamic societies in the UK. They call them Muslim student associations in the US. Do you have those in Singapore, Ustaz Jalaluddin? Like university organizations for Muslim students?
Yeah, we have them.
You call it like Islamic society, or what do you call it?
Islamic student societies.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, you combine the two, right? We
yeah.
we call it Islamic society in the UK, and then in the US they call it Muslim student associations. But like I've visited some of those in my time. I was even president of one at Leeds University. And sometimes I once saw, I think this in Nottingham, I saw a poster and it said like joining the student society. When was the last time you went on a march? When was the last time you protested? When was the last? It's like, but why, like, why are you reducing Islam to this, right? And if you think about the way people do this, like the protests and the marches and demonstrations, like you're asking politicians or whoever's in power or the head of your university to make a change, and you're forgetting that a law is in power, right? You're forgetting that a law is in charge of all things. Why aren't you turning to a law in this need? Um, so he goes on to say here, he said, Islam in its essence is based on realizing the meaning of slavery to Allah within one's own soul. Like you have to start there, right? This is the point of departure for every movement, every action, every struggle starts with Allah. Like like Allah is not going to change the state you're in until you change what's in yourself. You can't just neglect yourself, neglect bettering yourself before Allah and going out and protesting and marching and think that's going to change anything. You have to change who you are with Allah. And he says that on this page 30, he said says maybe many of them will make light of their worship, make light of their dhikr, attending the prayer in Jama'at, other acts that draw near to Allah, and striving to revive their heart, and so on and so forth. And they consider it to be that's just from common folk. We're busy. Let's use like I'm involved in dawah. I'm involved in this. I don't have time to go to the masjid. I don't have time to read Quran every day. I'm trying to revive the ummah. Like, well, you've got it back to front now, son. You got it back to front. If you're going to be involved in this kind of work, that's the bedrock of it. Now he says, obviously, yes, you can have the extreme where someone all they do is devotion, all they do is worship. They never come out and give dawah to anyone. They never talk to anyone. That's the other extreme. We're not monks. But if you're gonna be involved in that kind of work of calling people to Islam and trying to spread Islam, trying to establish the deen, the bedrock, the foundation of all of that activity is your personal devotion to Allah and your relationship with Allah. It has to be built on you reciting Quran every day, you doing adhkar, you praying your prayers in the masjid. That your relationship with Allah has to be solid. It can't be neglected. So he says in the conclusion, he says, what I'm saying does not mean that Islamic work should not rely on any planning or activism. Rather, what I mean is that the success of any Islamic work depends on an indispensable, essential foundation, which is rectification of the heart and it's being purified of worldly desires. Right? So that's the starting point. If we're going to be successful in our activism, our activity, our Islamic work, whatever you want to call it, it starts with the rectification of the heart. I think I'll stop there. Is that okay? Are we
Yep.
okay for time?